So Bryce, let's just start with sort of some of the, I guess the general numbers that we're looking at, and we'll get to what Donald Trump presumably did this past weekend from his country club in New Jersey, which just for no reason at all, I'll remind people, cost I think about $300,000 a year to join. But putting that aside for a moment, give me a sense of like just the numbers that we're talking about and what they're facing, particularly right around these weeks. And let's we will delineate from a federal perspective and from a state perspective.
Right. Yeah. The numbers are vast. They're very daunting. So we already know that at the beginning of July, 1 in 5 renters was already behind on rent. That was with enhanced unemployment benefits still available. And it seems like a lot of people were using those benefits to try to cover rent. We know that, demands for other kinds of assistance like food banks went up. So it seems like people were trying to sort of outsource those things but keep current on rent as much as they could, but many were falling behind. And then the projections are just really scary. They range a bit. We don't know exactly how many people are going to face eviction, but it's anywhere from 17 million people to as much as 40 million people at risk of eviction right now as these protections lapse all over the country, both at the state level and at the federal level. And just to put that into context, one point of comparison is that in all of 2016, there were 2.35 million evictions, so a tiny fraction of what's about to occur. You could also compare it to the Great Recession, which we think of as this huge housing crisis, and it really was. But in those 8 years, nearly 10 million people lost their homes to foreclosure. A huge amount, lots of human suffering, and yet that is going to be far outpaced by what we're about to experience.
Now, there's a lot of implications to this, and so I'm trying to just sort of, it is so hard to comprehend what we could be looking at. Let's just start with this. Do people owe? Okay, so they're not evicted because they're underpaying their rent. Do people? And we don't have a sense, but I would imagine that under an eviction moratorium, whether it's the federal one dealing with federal housing or ones that are imposed by the state that have to do with private housing, right? I would imagine what that does is it gives the renter an ability to negotiate rent. Never mind defer rent, but negotiate rent. If I'm a landlord and I know that I'm not allowed to evict anybody, and my tenant comes to me and says, let me pay you 50 cents on the dollar or 75 cents on the dollar for rent, that's all I have, I'm going to take it because I can't evict them anyways. So do we have a sense of like how many people, when it's one thing to not be evicted, it's another, you still owe the rent. You're not being able to make any money in many situations. Do we know like how much deferred rent in dollars is owed?
We don't know how much, in part because we don't know what people were able to work out. We don't know how much people have been able to, like I said, put their unemployment benefits towards rent, maybe get some rent relief. There have been some state level and city level rent relief programs. But what I can tell you is that you would think logically that landlords would, as you say, take this time to try to work something out. I mean, in this kind of economy, in this pandemic, it seems unlikely that if they evict someone, even if they can, that they're even going to be able to find someone who can pay rent to take their place. But what I'm hearing from legal aid lawyers and activists is landlords have really dug in their heels. Tenants have reached out to them and said, look, I lost my job. My hours have been reduced. What can we work out? And the landlords don't respond, or they just refuse to deal with them. And we also know that even as these moratoria have been in place, some of them still allowed paperwork to go forward. So you couldn't actually kick someone out, but you could start the process on paper, and landlords have been rushing to do that. There is this strange desire among landlords to get this process going with lots and lots of tenants. So I think we'll see, as soon as the protections lifting, lots and lots of people thrown into the court system and up against their landlords trying to fight off eviction. And as you say, many may have accumulated rent. So even if some moratoria are extended, on the other side, they will still potentially be thousands of dollars in debt to their landlord.
And so either way we slice it, when we talk about moratoriums, I mean, we can have some that were extended, right? And because every state has a different, to the extent that they have them, every state has a different, basically, drop dead date, more or less, at this point. Is that right?
That's correct. There may be one or two that decided to say, this is in effect until the pandemic is over, or this is in effect until the state of emergency lifts. But for the most part, they all have some date at which they expire. And they're all coming up right around now. I think the thought was, when they were instituted, that things would be better by now and we wouldn't be in this crisis that we're in. And obviously that's just not the case. So some have extended them, some have not. And the protections have just lifted. I talked to folks in New Orleans where it lifted in June, and there have been tons of eviction filings, and they're now sort of moving to eviction defense tactics because they don't have legislation in place to protect people.
Well, what do landlords think they're going to do here? I mean, this is the thing I don't quite understand. I mean, are they going to in this circumstance, and much of this is unprecedented. And I also have to say, the reason why, I talk about the staggered deadlines, regardless of how these deadlines are staggered, we're going to see an unprecedented number of people evicted within a 60, 90, maybe 120 day period of the likes we've not seen in maybe ever. I mean, is that
maybe
possible?
Ever. Maybe ever, because eviction was not nearly as widespread a tactic back in, say, the Great Depression. So this is something I don't think the country has really witnessed before.
What do landlords think they're going to do? Like, who is it that they think is going to move into their apartments or houses or wherever? I mean, I don't imagine that people are, moving around that much. I mean, to the extent that people who are, particularly people who don't have any resources, who do they think they're going to be putting into these apartments, these landlords?
I truly don't know. And yeah, a pandemic is a terrible time to have to move, especially when we've all been told that one of the things we can do to keep the spread down is to stay in our homes. So you don't really want a lot of people having to leave their homes, not having another place to go. I will say that there is a cost to a landlord of having someone in their apartment or their house, of upkeep of utilities, that perhaps goes down if they just kick someone out and it's empty. So it may be that they are thinking better to have it empty than filled with someone who can't pay. I do think it's unlikely that a lot of landlords are going to be able to find someone else to come in who's in a much better financial position. Even without the pandemic, making it difficult to move around, we have millions of people who are out of work right now. It's unemployment and a lack of income is a really widespread phenomenon. So it's hard to imagine what they're going to find.
So I guess we could talk about the federal response or the lack of federal response at this point. I mean, the federal moratorium has expired. We don't know about the state. There's a patchwork of moratoriums that states have imposed. I would imagine the vast majority of them, not all of them, you mentioned New Orleans, are still in effect. There could be theoretically city moratoriums as well, right? Municipal moratoriums on this. So there's a patchwork that's going around. What's the difference to me as a tenant if there's is the federal moratorium only deals with federal housing or housing that is getting Section 8 vouchers?
Right. Well, it's either Section 8 vouchers or the landlord has a federally supported mortgage, so through Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, something like that. And it's actually a fair number of tenants could be covered by a federal eviction moratorium. The challenge, even when it was in place, is that you have to know that your landlord counts. You have to know that your
Right.
landlord has a mortgage with Fannie Mae, which you probably don't. And landlords very much do not want people to know. Again, in New Orleans, people were saying, advocates searched on a database and were going into these complexes to tell tenants, you have a right here to not be evicted. And the landlords were coming through and ripping down the posters they put up. So it's hard to enforce unless it's something really straightforward like public housing where you know that you're covered. But of course, even that sort of flimsy protection is now gone. Democrats have put forward the HEROES Act, which includes a 12-month eviction moratorium for all renters who can't pay rent. So it's not just this sort of complicated eviction moratorium. It's much more blanket. Republicans, when they came back with their negotiations in the Senate, did not include anything about an eviction moratorium. And then there's, of course, what Trump did over the weekend, which basically, in a phrase, he did nothing of
Right.
much substance.
There's another way to deal with this, Bryce. I am sure that you have contemplated it, but where a landlord does not make the calculation that I've got a tenant that's paying me zero, and if I evict them, at the very least, they're not going to be wear and tear on my apartment and or home. And when the economy rebounds, I'm not going to have to spend more money in repairing it without having gotten rent from these folks. It seems to me that the federal government, I don't know how states would afford to do that at that point, but certainly the federal government could say, here, you want to join the rental assistance program? Here it is. We will pay half your rent, 3/4 of your rent. If you're a landlord, you sign off and you got to say, I'm good. I'll take 75 cents on the dollar. I'll take 50 cents on the dollar. And as soon as this date expires, back to full rent. Has anybody even floated that idea?
I haven't seen something quite so much asking landlords basically to write down rents. The two approaches that Democrats have put forward is in the HEROES Act, they included just $100 billion in emergency rental assistance. So that wouldn't require landlords to change anything on their side, but it would at least give renters some money to keep covering rent. The other approach from Omar and Ocasio-Cortez and the squad is to cancel rent and home mortgage payments and just say they are not owed for the duration of the pandemic. And instead what they do is they set up a relief fund for landlords and mortgage holders who need to cover their losses. So they sort of say, look, if you're a landlord experiencing financial distress, you come to us for relief and leave renters alone. Neither really seems to be moving, to be honest. So I don't know that there'll be any relief for either side coming from Congress anytime soon.
So I mean, what can we expect to see in the next month or two? I mean, I guess it's just really a question of whether states maintain their moratoriums, right? I mean, do we have a sense of is there a clearinghouse as to what moratoriums stay in place on a state level or a municipal level, and what the political will is to maintain it? Because I would imagine when it comes to a state and municipal level, real estate interests are going to be able to exert far more pressure than they would theoretically on the federal government.
I think that's right. Although I do think tenants and organizers are getting incredibly active right now. I'm seeing a lot of advocacy around housing that I didn't necessarily see before. In terms of clearinghouse, if you're curious in your own state as to what's going on, Eviction Lab has compiled information on all the state and local protections that may exist. So there is at least a database of what's going on currently. But yeah, I mean, I think what we're going to see is mass eviction. I do think that there's going to be a huge amount of housing displacement. It's going to be incredibly disruptive, obviously, to people's lives, also to the economy. There are costs to eviction, to people's health. There are costs to their finances. This is not just a simple, leave one apartment, go to the other. And I also think we're going to see a lot of activism. Like I said, I've seen some eviction defense tactics in New Orleans. There's been some mobilizing in New York, and I'm sure other places too, where if advocates don't have protection from legal moratoriums, they're just going to put their bodies in the way. In New Orleans, advocates went to housing court, and so many of them were at the entrance that they blocked people from going in and shut housing court down for the day. I think we're going to see a lot more tactics like that out of just honestly sheer desperation to help people find some sort of relief for people.
If people want to get more information about getting involved in those type of activities where you are engaging in some form of protest to gum up the works to help keep people in their homes, do you have any ideas of where they would be looking online?
Well, I know that there are a lot of tenant unions springing up, and at least in New York, that's where a lot of this organizing is coming from. Tenants sort of banding together, and then, of course, joining forces with housing advocates, legal defense lawyers here in New York, and I think elsewhere too, are getting involved and trying to say, keep housing court shut. Not just, it should be noted, to keep people from being evicted, but also because courts have been a source of COVID spread, and people don't want either tenants or their attorneys going into these courtrooms, breathing each other's air and spreading the disease. So there's been some linking of arms between those groups and you could reach out to those and see what's happening, who's mobilizing.
I still, I mean, it's, and I wish we could be more satisfying to people in terms of what to anticipate here, because I guess the real question is, are we going to be able to get a sense of the enormity of this problem because it is so disparate, right? I mean, when we're talking about tens of millions of people, we're talking across the country.
Right, across the country and in people's own private homes. I don't think eviction always makes the news. It's a very personal and painful thing to go through. But I do think it's possible on the scale we're about to see that it will actually become visible. People have talked about in New Orleans, for example, seeing just piles and piles of people's belongings on sidewalks. This is something I think that we will potentially actually be faced with as it becomes more widespread. It's just a sheer mass of people, tens of millions of people who are at risk of losing their housing.
Well, Bryce Covert, writing in The Nation, America's headed for an unprecedented wave of evictions. That headline, in many respects, says it all. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.